How the mainstream media serve the government-enforced medical cartel. A New York Times article claiming to debunk the oral health benefits of coconut oil polling illuminates its service to the government-enforced medical cartel that masquerades as a healthcare system in the U.S. By Jeremy R. Hammond. Introduction. When I first saw the New York Times headline, 5 Health Trends We Debunked This Year, it caught my attention because anytime a mainstream media outlet claims to debunk something, there is a pretty good chance that the supposed myth is true, and health-related topics are certainly no exception to this general trend. The instant I saw it, I thought to myself, I bet there will be at least one example here of the Times feigning to debunk a natural health remedy that really does help people, but if widely practiced, would harm the financial interests of the corrupt medical establishment that perversely passes for a healthcare system in the U.S., which is itself a major cause of the frighteningly poor health of most Americans, including the childhood population. I anticipated that I would find a faux debunking because I have come to understand how the statist New York Times, a standard bearer of what passes for journalism in the mainstream discourse, does not produce honest and objective reporting, but instead does policy advocacy and public relations in service to this government-enforced medical cartel. I was thus compelled by curiosity to click the link to see whether I had anticipated correctly. The Times did not disappoint. Sure enough, Times writer Julia Calderon introduces the list of debunked claims by talking about the supposed ineffectiveness of oil pulling, which is the routine practice of swishing a food oil around in your mouth for a while before spitting it out, a traditional practice in medicine dating back at least 3,000 years. Calderon relates how she tried coconut oil pulling for a while and concluded from her experience that it was a useless habit. This further intrigued me because we do this practice in my own household, and we've come to the opposite conclusion. After sharing her personal anecdote, Calderon provides links to 5 previous Times articles with a short summary for each. She says that each one is about a health trend that the Times investigated and provided, quote, deep reporting, end quote, about, to determine, quote, whether they actually work, end quote. The first item on the list illustrates what a joke this is, because it is such an obvious strawman fallacy. The claim, supposedly debunked, is that, quote, apple cider vinegar is a cure-all, end quote. Don't believe it, the Times warns, because, quote, for many of the promised benefits, there's no research at all, experts say, end quote. We could, of course, reasonably distrust the opinion of supposed experts and dig deeper, but that would be superfluous in this case, because we can stipulate that not all the claimed benefits of apple cider vinegar are supported by scientific research, while recognizing the Times' tacit acknowledgement that it does have other scientifically verified health benefits. Moving on to the claim that particularly fascinated me, Calderon links to a Times article from July about oil pulling while warning her readers not to believe anyone who claims that doing this, quote, will prevent cavities and gum recession and whiten your teeth, end quote. I laughed to myself when I read that because I instantly knew that I had indeed correctly anticipated a faux debunking of a natural health remedy that is supported by scientific evidence. The hoax claim here is not that oil pulling is beneficial for oral health, but the New York Times' counter-argument that there's no scientific evidence to support this conclusion. And to demonstrate that the Times claim is a hoax, all we need to do is examine the Times' own cited source from the medical literature. Before we get to that, though, please allow me to explain how I already knew just from reading the headline that by clicking the link to read more, I was likely to find a hoax debunking of a natural health remedy. Because if you understand how I predicted this, you will be able to fully appreciate the true significance of this case study in journalistic malpractice. To be clear, this is not about the practice of oil pulling, a topic in which you might have little or no interest. Instead, what I am really talking about here is how there exists a government-enforced medical cartel that masquerades as a healthcare system and is detrimental to public health, and how the mainstream corporate media serve the financial interests of this cartel with their incessant efforts at brainwashing. My personal experiences with the medical establishment. As I mentioned, I was even further intrigued by the New York Times claim to have debunked the oral health benefits of oil pulling because we practice it in my own household. And do you know why? Because after we first heard about oil pulling, I was my usual skeptical self, so I went to pubmed.gov to search the medical literature and see for myself whether there was any science to support it. Doing my own research this way is a matter of habit for me. I had done the same thing many times before on numerous other issues, including with practices that the government and mainstream media either wanted me to regard as pure quackery or wanted me to have complete faith in and not ask questions about. And most of the time I have researched a particular health topic for myself, what I found in the literature was practically the opposite of what we are told to believe. As I have been meticulously documenting for many years, what the government and media say science says, and what science really tells us, are two completely different things. This should have become startlingly obvious to any free-thinking individual during the COVID-19 lockdown madness and its coerced mass vaccination endgame, but it is a key lesson that most Americans remain stubbornly persistent in refusing to learn. Most specifically, the belief that we need the government to take care of us by intervening in the market for healthcare is downright delusional. You might not agree with that just yet, but my aim is to persuade you by the time you are done acquiring the knowledge I will share with you in this article. Julia Calderon began her article with a personal anecdote, so before dissecting this supposed debunking of oil pulling by the New York Times, allow me to relate a few examples from my own experiences with the medical establishment that sufficiently illustrate my point that the medical system in the U.S. is irredeemably corrupt and does more harm than good. As I like to say, one of the best ways to stay healthy is to avoid seeing doctors. Doctors' ignorance of vaccines. After my wife became pregnant and before my son was born in 2012, I began intensely researching the medical literature to be able to make informed choices about each of the pharmaceutical products on the routine childhood vaccine schedule recommended by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC. I started out skeptical of the supposed miracle of these products that are classified by the Food and Drug Administration, FDA, as biological products, or biologics. After all, we evolved to have an effective immune system capable of fending off pathogens, or, if you prefer, God created us that way. Since my early childhood, I could never reconcile that obvious reality with the whole premise of vaccination. No matter how hard society tried to indoctrinate me into this belief, I just couldn't be convinced that we all require all of these shots to be able to have a properly functioning immune system. My logical mind would never let me arrive at the conclusion that I must place my faith in a pharmaceutical product instead of my own body's wondrous innate abilities. Or, if you prefer, instead of placing my faith in God and His perfect creation made in His image. The scientifically verified reality that was intuitively obvious to me as a child is that children need pathogenic challenges to train their immune systems, and that having this functional immunity is essential to living a long and healthy life. The idea that good health must come from being injected with some chemical concoction that includes such ingredients as aluminum and mercury has always seemed ludicrous to me. Are we not to treat our body as a temple? Are our immune systems not designed to protect us from disease, provided that we give our bodies what they need to maintain functional immunity? I could never reconcile this inherent self-contradiction, and because the system thus failed to indoctrinate me properly into the vaccine religion, when my wife became pregnant, I was prompted to do my own research into the medical literature. This is the opposite of what the so-called public health establishment wants you to do, which is to just trust a 2-page vaccine information statement from the CDC that basically just says, vaccines are awesome, they work awesomely, they are really safe, and everyone needs to get them all. And what's on the CDC's information sheets is pretty much all that pediatricians are taught about vaccines in medical school, as attested to me by the heroic Dr. Paul Thomas, whose story every parent needs to know, and which you can read in my book, The War on Informed Consent, The Persecution of Dr. Paul Thomas by the Oregon Medical Board. So, when I first started digging into the literature, I fully expected to find a disparity between what I had been told about vaccines and what the science says. But what I instead found was no mere disparity, but an unbridgeable chasm. By doing my own research, I came into the realization that there are no greater purveyors of vaccine disinformation than the government, the mainstream media, and the medical cartel masquerading as a healthcare system. Notice that I used the word disinformation instead of vaccine misinformation. That is because the criminal establishment spreads information deliberately for the purpose of manipulating public opinion. In my research, I started at the beginning with the very first vaccine on the CDC schedule, which is the hepatitis B, Hep B vaccine. The CDC recommends that this shot be administered as a 3-dose series to every baby starting on the very first day of life. But for my wife and I, not doing that shot was a no-brainer. It made no medical sense whatsoever for our son to receive this aluminum-containing vaccine. People at risk for this disease are sexually promiscuous or intravenous drug users. Infants only have a significant risk if the mother is a carrier, and routine screening is done during pregnancy to determine this. So I naturally wondered why the CDC would recommend it for every newborn, and I found the answer provided by the CDC itself, which had nothing to do with medical science and was based purely on political considerations. See, when the CDC issued this recommendation in 1991, the problem it was aiming to solve was its failure to achieve the goal of a high vaccination rate among subpopulations who are at risk of the disease. The CDC's solution to this perceived problem was to just start indiscriminately vaccinating everyone on the day of birth. As far as the CDC was concerned, problem solved. This was simply not a medical decision that was made with the best interests of the childhood population in mind. Rather, it was a political decision transparently intended to serve the financial interests of the pharmaceutical industry by creating an artificial demand for this product. It was absolutely clear to me from the medical literature that the CDC's recommendation places most children at unnecessary risk of harm from the aluminum-containing Hep B vaccine, which is downright criminal. How could any free-thinking pediatrician with a respect for basic medical ethics choose to push this product onto parents whose children are not at risk from the disease? This is one of the most unambiguous examples of how the CDC serves the pharmaceutical industry at the expense of children's health. And to see it requires hardly any research. You need only to just scratch the surface to come to this realization. And yet, there we were being confronted with the expectation not to even question it. Just shut up, stop thinking for yourself, trust the experts, and get the damn shot. How stupid did they think we were? I apologize if that rhetorical question offends any of my readers who did place their faith in the medical establishment and consented to that shot without being fully informed. It is not my intent to offend. I'm just being honest. We are all deceived sometimes, and we all make mistakes. My wife and I have our own regrets as parents, but not vaccinating our son is not one of them. With my research, I continued down the list of CDC-recommended vaccines in the order that our son was expected to get them. Eventually, after several years and what amounted easily to hundreds if not thousands of hours in the literature, my conscience compelled me to start sharing what I had learned publicly. I was hesitant at first because I knew what a huge target that would be placing on my back. But then, I was also used to being attacked already from the work exposing dangerous mainstream propaganda, serving to manufacture consent for criminal foreign policies, like the war on Iraq waged on a pretext of lies, and support for Israel's systematic violation of Palestinians' fundamental human rights. And, as with those topics, I knew that I had the advantage of having the truth on my side. So I started writing about vaccines and exposing how public vaccine policy results in the systematic violation of the right to informed consent. Doing that work made me well prepared to speak out right from the very start against the COVID-19 lockdown madness and its coerced mass vaccination endgame, including by exposing the CDC's brazen lie in August 2021 that the mRNA COVID-19 vaccines conferred better protection against SARS-CoV-2 than natural immunity, a heresy and truth-telling that got me banned from LinkedIn, even though my primary source was the CDC's own data, as reported by its own researchers in its own journal. CDC researchers had finally admitted that natural immunity was superior, but we journalists were not allowed to publicize that fact on social media because only regime-approved messages serving the policy goal of a high vaccination rate were being permitted, no matter how ridiculous and easily falsifiable the government-approved vaccine disinformation. My pursuit of truth since my son's birth led several years later to our expulsion from a pediatric practice for the grave offense of researching the medical literature for ourselves, doing our own thinking, and trusting our own judgment instead of just blindly obeying orders from the perversely named Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Relatedly, we were also expelled by the only pediatric dentist in town for declining fluoride treatment, and although that is a whole other story, I will come briefly back to that topic below. For our sin of heresy against the vaccine religion, we were excommunicated and disallowed a medical home for our child. And do you know what the single most important consequence of our sinfulness was? We have a son who is healthy. In fact, there is no slight irony in the fact that the last time my son saw his primary care physician, prior to the visit in which we were told to either get our son every CDC-recommended vaccine or never come back, the doctor joked with my son about only getting to see him once a year for a routine checkup because he's so healthy. You can read the scathing letter I mailed to all 4 pediatricians in that group practice, excoriating them for their willful ignorance of the science on vaccines, which had extended to expelling healthy unvaccinated children so as not to have a control group with which to compare health outcomes with the general population of highly vaccinated and chronically ill children. You can also learn much more about how scientific data show that completely unvaccinated children are far healthier in my book, The War on Informed Consent. To further illuminate how I was able to correctly anticipate being gaslighted by the New York Times about the benefits of coconut oil pulling, I'll share 2 more examples from my personal experiences dealing with the government-enforced medical cartel. Doctors' ignorance of leaky gut. Prior to my son's birth, I had for years suffered from what doctors meaninglessly call irritable bowel syndrome, IBS, which is basically just a blanket term they use to describe gut symptoms that they don't really understand and don't want to put the effort into determining the actual cause of. I had already learned to largely manage my gut symptoms simply by cutting wheat out of my diet. But several months after our son's birth, I started experiencing new symptoms for which, at first, I didn't draw a connection to my gut health. First, I started getting itchy rashes without any explanation, and this worsened rapidly until I was soon so itchy all the time that I was constantly irritable and terribly sleep deprived. Additionally, I experienced such a severe migraine, my first ever, that it put me in the emergency room, fearing that I must be dying from a brain tumor and would leave my infant son fatherless and my wife a widow, which was absolutely traumatizing. I had always thought that a migraine was just a bad headache. I had no idea about the aura in one's vision, much less that it could cause my entire right arm to go numb and affect the ability of my brain to verbalize thoughts. I could think a thought, like a person's name, but as soon as I tried to put that thought into words, it was gone. My brain literally lost its ability to communicate. While I fortunately never experienced a migraine that severe again, more followed at an alarming frequency, sometimes putting me out of commission for days at a time. My skin symptoms worsened, and new symptoms arose such as brain fog and constant tingling in my fingers. This sent me once again searching earnestly in the medical literature to try to figure out what was wrong, and I ultimately diagnosed myself with a condition known as leaky gut. This condition is also known in the literature as intestinal hyperpermeability and refers to a situation in which the gut lining is damaged, resulting in dysfunctional absorption. For example, I was able to determine that my finger tingling was caused by a deficiency of vitamin B12. At the same time, larger molecules that would normally be expelled as waste were passing through my gut lining and triggering inflammatory immune reactions. Although I had determined the cause of my debilitating symptoms by doing my own research, I hadn't yet learned to trust my own judgment. I still sought confirmation and help from the state-licensed medical professionals. But my efforts to get help from the medical establishment proved utterly futile. When I would tell doctors of my self-diagnosis, I was met with endless efforts to gaslight me. Of the numerous doctors I saw, only one acknowledged that leaky gut is real. All the rest denied its very existence, which was shocking to me because I had read scores of studies on it. At the time, I had already collected around 100 papers specifically about leaky gut out of thousands of search results for the condition at PubMed, and not once had I ever encountered any paper that questioned its existence. In the literature, the existence of leaky gut as a medical condition is completely uncontroversial. And yet, whenever I would try to talk to a doctor about it, I would be met with the insistence that there is no such condition. I would explain how I'd been researching it extensively in the medical literature, but they just talked back to me like I must have been just making that up too. They absolutely refused to listen, and instead of simply looking it up for themselves to see that I was right, they persisted in gaslighting me and insisting that I would just have to be dependent on pharmaceutical treatments for the rest of my life because you can't heal the symptoms of a non-existent condition. And there was otherwise no known medical cure for irritable bowel syndrome, chronic hives, frequent migraines, etc. The mainstream licensed quacks even refused to order a simple and inexpensive urine test designed to measure gut absorption and permeability by having you swallow 2 sugars of different molecule sizes. Every one of them refused to do so, even after I'd sent them the link to a lab where any physician could order it, which I provided, along with dozens of studies in which that same test was either described or utilized by researchers to investigate the known condition of leaky gut. The doctors' sheer ignorance was matched only by their arrogance and condescension. When I would tell them I was pretty sure I had leaky gut, they would literally mock me. I already mentioned my PCP, who insisted my itchy rashes were just typical food allergies, despite my never having had any immune reactions to any foods my whole life until then. Wanting to prove me wrong, he ordered an allergy blood test. I told him I expected the result to come back negative, which it did, but he still refused to consider the possibility that I was right. Instead, he referred me to an allergist in another part of the state for a skin prick test, which he felt sure would prove his alternative hypothesis. When the allergist walked into the examination room, I immediately explained to him why I felt my visit was a waste of time. I explained that I did not have food allergies and was only there because my PCP had insisted upon the skin prick test because of his disagreement with me about my self-diagnosis of leaky gut. The allergist's response to that was to condescendingly scorn, "You read a lot on the internet, don't you?" After a moment of dumbfounded speechlessness, I replied, "Well, yeah, I go to PubMed.gov and research the medical literature." For the sake of diplomacy, I refrained from adding, "You should try it sometime," but I now regret having bitten my tongue. I should have said it. I would have been right to do so, and that quack would have deserved it. The skin prick test came back negative too, of course. I was right and they were wrong, but they still refused to admit it. I should have learned my lesson, but alas, I stubbornly persisted in trying to get help from the licensed medical professionals. Surely a gastroenterologist would know about leaky gut, I naively reasoned, so I went to see one. But I was wrong. Instead of being taken seriously, I was once again gaslighted and brazenly lied to. And that was the last straw. That was the point at which I stopped trying to get help from the medical establishment. By that time, I had already sufficiently established from my own research that the cause of my symptoms was leaky gut. By then, my sole purpose was to get a physician to just order the goddamned urine test to help verify my self-diagnosis. Why was that so hard for them? Why were they all refusing to do that? The fact that this simple and reasonable request had proved so impossible forced me into the realization that I would not find any help from within the medical establishment. I was forced to find my own healing path, despite the medical doctors. I proved my diagnosis correct by successfully eliminating my debilitating symptoms. By ignoring the doctors and following my own path, I accomplished what, in their narrow-minded paradigm, amounted to a miracle in healing. I did what they thought impossible by treating myself for a condition they refused to even acknowledge the existence of. As I came to realize, the simple reason for their willful ignorance of the science was that the CDC and American Medical Association, AMA, hadn't created a diagnostic code for leaky gut that would enable them to bill insurance companies or government healthcare programs. Since there was no diagnostic code for it, in the doctor's thinking, it did not exist. The regime of medical licensing, which the AMA lobbied for with the aim of eliminating competition and establishing their own medical monopoly, was implemented under the thinly veiled pretext that licensing was necessary to protect the public from charlatans. But meanwhile, the AMA itself was practicing quackery like bloodletting and mercury treatments. The aim and effect of the state licensing regime was to force out of practice doctors who took natural approaches to maintaining good health instead of pushing pharmaceutical drugs on people. The regime of medical licensing is also used to threaten any physicians who fall out of line with the medical cartel's approach, such as Dr. Paul Thomas, who dared to speak out against the medical tyranny and to respect parents' right to make their own informed choices about childhood vaccinations. For his heresy against the vaccine religion, he was stripped of his license. The incredible irony is that the state medical board issued an emergency suspension order against him just days after he had fulfilled the board's demand to produce peer-reviewed evidence supporting his alternative approach of respecting the right to informed consent, as opposed to doing what the state expects of pediatricians, which is to bully their patients into vaccinating according to the CDC schedule. As I detail in The War on Informed Consent, Dr. Thomas published a study comparing a broad range of health outcomes between vaccinated and completely unvaccinated patients, which showed clearly that the unvaccinated patients were the healthiest children in his practice. Are you beginning to see what I mean about the existence of a government-enforced medical cartel in the US? If you want to get help with a condition for which mainstream medicine is still practicing decades behind the science, if at all, you have to pay out of pocket to see what is called an alternative natural health practitioner, whom the establishment wants you to think are all just a bunch of quacks, even when those practitioners are actually healing patients, while the mainstream doctors only manage to cause more harm than good with their expensive, invasive, and risky procedures and their total reliance on pharmaceutical drugs to treat symptoms, which cause more symptoms requiring more drugs, and so on. So who are the real quacks? The lesson that I had once again learned from my experience trying to get help from doctors was that I had to stop listening to so-called medical professionals and instead do my own thinking and trust my own judgment. That's an abridged version of my story, which you can get more shocking details about, plus learn what steps I took to heal by downloading my free ebook about leaky gut. Dentists' ignorance of mercury toxicity. To illustrate my point with just one more example, as I was healing, thanks in large part to dietary changes, accommodated by my wife's amazing culinary skills, she was experiencing debilitating symptoms of her own that were growing gradually worse. Not yet having fully learned our lesson, we made the mistake of trying to get help from so-called licensed medical professionals, who managed to only make her symptoms even worse. As I had done with vaccines and leaky gut, though, I started digging into the medical literature to solve the mystery for myself. Once again, my research enabled me to accurately diagnose the cause, which was mercury toxicity from her dental amalgams, otherwise known misleadingly as silver fillings. It became obvious that we needed to get her amalgams removed, but I had also learned from the literature that a safety protocol needed to be followed to avoid excess harm from an acute exposure to the mercury vapor that would unavoidably be released during the procedure. But our local dentists knew nothing about the safe protocol and otherwise seemed incognizant of the irreconcilable self-contradiction between the corrupt American Dental Association, ADA, insisting that mercury fillings are safe, despite dentists having to treat them as toxic waste upon removal from a person's mouth. So, we sought out a mercury-aware dentist and found one in another part of the state, and after the removal, which we coupled with an extended detox regimen, she got better. We kept a detailed record of her symptoms using a scoring method both before and after the removal. It took some time, but after about a year, the difference in her health was night and day. While the ADA's position is insistent that mercury toxicity was not the cause of my wife's symptoms, by ignoring the experts and trusting our own judgment, we accomplished what again amounted, within the paradigm of mainstream medicine, to a second miracle in healing. The miracle of coconut oil pulling. There are other stories I could share to further illustrate my point, but those three in particular epitomize my own household's experience with the medical system, which is really just a government-enforced medical cartel focused more on generating profits for the pharmaceutical industry and partnered trade organizations, given special status by the government, than in achieving a healthy population. Hence, the frighteningly poor health of most Americans and epidemic rates of chronic diseases and disorders among both the adult and childhood populations. The statist New York Times is, of course, a major cheerleader for their irredeemably corrupt medical establishment, as I had also come to learn during my studies, compelled by necessity into various health-related issues. Which brings me back to my story about having searched the literature for myself years ago to see whether there was any science supporting the practice of coconut oil pulling. So let me tell you what led me to do that research in the first place. See, the dentists at the local clinic we were going to had insisted that, once gums have receded, you can only hope to stop further recession because gums can never heal back to normal. My wife and I intuitively felt that to be an absurd denial of the body's natural ability to heal. Plus, I had already experienced periods of gum recession and regrowth earlier in my life, and their gaslighting had spurred us to prove them wrong by exploring natural paths to better oral health, which led my wife to discover oil pulling. When she first told me about it, as I mentioned, I was skeptical, so I searched the literature to see if there was any science supporting it. And do you want to take a guess at what I learned from that research? You've got it. There was. Consequently, my wife and I started doing oil pulling regularly with the goal of preventing cavities and improving gum health. And do you know what happened next? Our oral health improved. We haven't had any cavities since, and we both experienced gum healing. In fact, my wife's oral health improved so dramatically that it amounted to what the dentists had literally defined as a miracle, a healing of her gums that they had insisted was biologically impossible. Take that counter-anecdote, Julia Calderon. How the New York Times brazenly lies about its own cited sources. Now you can fully appreciate why, having come across Calderon's debunking article, my curiosity was piqued about how the Times had gone about arriving at the opposite conclusion that I had, based on my own research into the literature, coupled with my own experience of using oil pulling to good effect. Spoiler alert, the answer is that the Times' supposed deep reporting on oil pulling is just another example of the typically lazy, pro-medical cartel, anti-natural remedy reporting that we have all come to expect from the lockdown-loving New York Times and the rest of the mainstream media on anything health-related. To provide some additional relevant context to help you see what I mean, back in 2018, I wrote a 4-part series exposing the flu shot fraud, everything you ever wanted to know about flu shots but the CDC didn't tell you, which kicked off with the detailed exposure of the hoax claim from the New York Times that a Cochrane systematic review and meta-analysis had found flu shots to confer, quote, a big payoff in public health, end quote. That was a brazen lie, literally the opposite of what the review actually said. In fact, the authors of that Cochrane review concluded that the fundamental assumptions underlying the CDC's universal flu shot recommendation were unsupported by scientific evidence. They explicitly stated that, far from conferring a huge public health benefit, the findings of their review, quote, seem to discourage the utilization of vaccination against influenza in healthy adults as a routine public health measure, end quote. In fact, they went so far in their criticism of the recommendation as to accuse the CDC of deliberately mischaracterizing the science to support its policy. And in the written version of this article, you can find the link to an infographic visually comparing what the Times says, the science says, and what the science actually says about flu shot effectiveness, as well as one doing the same regarding flu shot safety. This gross mischaracterization of its own cited sources is not an outlier. It is typical of the Times reporting. Simply stated, America's newspaper of record does policy advocacy, not journalism. And the same goes for the rest of the mainstream media. So, again, you can begin to understand why I anticipated being gaslighted by the 5 Health Trends We Debunked article, which proved to be another case of the New York Times grossly mischaracterizing the literature by making a claim that is contradicted by its own cited source. Demanding scientific proof of oil pulling's benefits. The 5 Health Trends article linked to another New York Times article from July titled, Swish, Spit, Repeat, Is Oil Pulling Good for Your Teeth? The author is Melinda Wenner-Moyer, whose pro-pharma bias I demonstrated in my 2018 article, Public Vaccine Policy Has Taken Science Hostage, a play on an article she wrote titled, Anti-Vaccine Activists Have Taken Vaccine Science Hostage. In her oil pulling piece, her bias in favor of the medical cartel is also evident from her lazy reliance on the American Dental Association as a source. Moyer's deep reporting on oil pulling consisted of the following. Citing Dr. Parul Dua Makar, a dental professional, recommending against the practice and saying, there is no scientific proof of any benefits of oil pulling. Citing the ADA saying, there are no reliable scientific studies to show that oil pulling reduces cavities, whitens teeth, or improves oral health and well-being. Citing a 2022 analysis of 9 small clinical trials, which concluded that oil pulling could indeed help reduce the bacteria in the mouth, but that it does not reduce plaque, the sticky film of bacteria that adheres to teeth, gum redness, inflammation, or bleeding. Citing another dentist, Dr. Mark S. Wolf, who tried it once himself and says that oil pulling can be a waste of time. In sum, this deep reporting consisted of providing a single ADA-approved opinion expressed 3 times and a single study. Moyer concedes that oil pulling might reduce bad breath, but she casts doubt on that conclusion too by characterizing it as falling short of scientific proof. The ADA's use of the adjective reliable to modify the noun studies is also telling because it reveals how Moyer is using sleight of hand to dismiss the evidence. Naturally, every study has its methodological limitations, but when a study's findings can be cited to support some public policy or standard of care within the medical establishment, those limitations are typically ignored and the studies are cited as determinative. Whereas, when studies' findings contradict public policy and standard practice, suddenly they are woefully inadequate and unreliable due to methodological limitations that render their findings far short of scientific proof. This double standard is epitomized by the media's treatment of vaccine studies. I provided the following instructive example in the fourth installment of my series on flu shots, titled The CDC's Criminal Recommendation for a Flu Shot During Pregnancy, which is a recommendation made despite the exclusion of pregnant women from randomized controlled trials. Quote, as we saw in Part 1, when Aaron E. Carroll in the New York Times advocated the CDC's flu shot recommendations, he was telling pregnant women, too, to get vaccinated. He was, in other words, parroting the CDC's implicit message that we can trust that observational studies are methodologically robust enough to rule out the possibility, with a high degree of confidence, that vaccination could cause harm to the expectant mother or her child. Yet just a few months earlier, Carroll had reassured the public that observational studies finding a link between alcohol consumption and cancer aren't determinative, and suggested that more randomized controlled trials are needed to establish what harms and benefits are associated with drinking. As he advised Times readers in that case, don't give too much weight to observational data. End quote. I illuminated that particular double standard of Carroll's in more detail in my article, Why Don't the Media Cover Vaccine Science the Same Way? In sum, the sleight of hand is to treat any studies supportive of the financial interests of the medical cartel as determinative, whereas any studies casting doubt on mainstream medicine or proposing alternative approaches to health are treated with scornful skepticism. It is only with the latter that the media focus on methodological limitations, whereas serious and even fatal flaws are dutifully ignored as long as the study produces the right findings. By raising the bar to the level of scientific proof, Moyer is allowing herself plenty of wriggle room. It is a brazen rhetorical deception, enabling her to offhandedly dismiss all the evidence supporting the hypothesis that oil pulling is good for your oral health. To further illustrate my point, we can all recall, of course, how when the mRNA COVID-19 vaccines were first rolled out, the New York Times and the rest of the mainstream media did not require scientific proof that they would stop infection and transmission of SARS-CoV-2. Instead, the media were universally content to repeat the willful lie that the shots would do so, despite the total absence of scientific evidence to support that hypothesis. In truth, the clinical trials were not designed to determine effectiveness against infection and transmission, and the vaccines were never expected to confer such sterilizing immunity, as it is called, because they weren't designed to, as the pathological liar Dr. Anthony Fauci finally admitted in an article published in Cell Host and Microbe in January 2023. Of course, those of us who were pointing out at the time of the vaccine's rollout under the FDA's emergency use authorization that there was no scientific evidence to support the claim being made the shots would confer durable sterilizing immunity were preposterously accused of spreading vaccine misinformation and censored. See, there is no healthcare system in the U.S., only a system of medical tyranny, a government-enforced medical cartel that serves the financial interests of certain industries at the expense of public health. The ADA's lack of credibility. Dr. Makar's absurd standard of demanding absolute scientific proof in lieu of mere supporting evidence is easily enough explained by the fact that she is not only a member of the ADA, but also a wellness ambassador for the organization. The ADA is a trade organization that, due to the special status given to it by the federal government and the regime of medical licensure, basically defines standard of care in dentistry, the same as how the American Medical Association, AMA, basically defines standard of care for physicians with its own government-enforced monopoly on the practice of medicine. Do not make the mistake of equating standard of care with evidence-based medicine. It could be fatal. There is a reason the U.S. population is so frighteningly unhealthy, and the medical establishment is a big part of it. Like the AMA, the ADA is inherently biased against alternative and natural approaches to health, an illuminating example of which is the ADA's opposition to the removal of dental amalgams for any reasons related to concerns about mercury's known toxicity. The ADA statement cited by Moyer in the New York Times says that the organization does not recommend oil pulling as an additional practice to flossing and brushing, the latter of which the ADA recommends doing with a fluoride-containing toothpaste. We don't use fluoride toothpaste in my own household, and as I mentioned earlier, we were unethically expelled from the only pediatric dental clinic in town for declining fluoride treatment for our son. As I learned afterward by attaining his full medical records, that dentist literally falsified his medical records by claiming that he had multiple cavities when in fact he had none. Prior to the expulsion, she had tried to scare us into accepting the fluoride treatment by claiming he had a cavity, singular, not plural. But I was unconvinced from the tiny shadow she was pointing to on the x-ray, and I am sure that my lack of faith in her interpretation was one of the reasons she expelled us. I made her lose face in front of her staff by disagreeing with her and rejecting her recommended treatment. I was right, though. We took the same x-rays to the mercury-aware dentist who had removed my wife's amalgams, whom we trusted, and he confirmed, from both the images and an oral examination, that our son had 0 cavities. Numerous subsequent visits to a different local dentist over the years also confirmed that he never had any cavities. So good riddance to that fluoride-advocating quack. I'm sure she makes the ADA proud. I filed a formal complaint against her with the state licensing board for her unethical practice, but nothing came of it because, of course, she also makes the government bureaucrats proud by trying to force standard of care on her patients with her proven treachery. Like the CDC, the ADA has also long been an advocate of government bureaucrats practicing medicine without a license by drugging whole communities with a known neurotoxin and without any ability to control individuals' dose of exposure, a fact that is particularly concerning when it comes to the cognitive development of children. I'm talking, of course, about the long-standing government practice of treating community water supplies with a chemical waste byproduct from the phosphate fertilizer industry, which an Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, official in 1983 described as, quote, an ideal solution to a long-standing problem, end quote. The problem being, of course, how to cheaply dispose of what is recognized in the scientific literature as hazardous waste. The U.S. federal regulatory system likewise classifies the fluorosilicic acid byproduct of the fertilizer industry as hazardous material, or hazardous substance. In case you still don't know what I'm referring to, it's the unethical practice of water fluoridation. As stated in a 2014 critical review of the policy of water fluoridation in Scientific World Journal, quote, the practice of artificial water fluoridation should be reconsidered globally, end quote, and governmental agencies should stop treating it as an essential nutrient to be delivered systemically via the water supply, quote, not least because it is irrational to have daily nutrient intakes for a hazardous substance whose mode of action is topical on teeth enamel, end quote. In other words, fluoride needn't and shouldn't be ingested. Just a few months ago, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services issued a report admitting that there is a large body of evidence that fluoride exposure is associated with lower IQ in children and could cause neurodevelopmental and cognitive harm. Even more recently, a historic ruling occurred in the case of Food and Water Watch, Inc. versus United States Environmental Protection Agency, with a U.S. District Court issuing a verdict ordering the EPA to take meaningful action to address concerns about the risk of neurotoxicity from fluoridated water. As stated by the Fluoride Action Network, one of the plaintiffs in the case, quote, the verdict is a significant loss for the EPA and the promoters of fluoridation like the American Dental Association and the U.S. Centers for Disease Control, because the court found that their claims of safety, made for over 75 years, were in fact not supported by evidence. The ruling did not specify exactly what measures must be adopted by the EPA, but under the Toxic Substances Control Act, TSCA, once the court rules that a chemical poses an unreasonable risk, the EPA is obligated by law to restrict or eliminate the risk, end quote. The Guardian appropriately reported, quote, for decades, drinking water fluoridation opponents were often portrayed as a fringe element in conspiracy theorists, but a federal ruling in the U.S. may put an end to the practice and marks a pivotal point in their campaign to convince the public and policymakers of the substance's dangers for infants' developing brains. Armed with a growing body of scientific evidence pointing toward fluoride's neurotoxicity, public health advocates say the legal win shows they are overcoming institutional inertia and the unwillingness of federal public health agencies to admit they may have been wrong. End quote. Thus, the ADA claims that dental amalgams are safe and opposes their removal despite the obvious risks arising from chronic exposure to a known neurotoxin, and the ADA continues to advocate water fluoridation as safe, even though this policy makes no logical sense, and despite the growing mountain of evidence that it is causing harm, especially to the childhood population. Those ADA policy positions contrast remarkably with the organization's refusal to recommend the simple, inexpensive, and harmless habit of oil pulling. It does so on the grounds that there is no evidence to support this practice, but that is just another bald-faced lie, as I will now demonstrate for you by simply examining the New York Times' own cited source from the medical literature. The ADA and New York Times versus the science on oil pulling. Returning to the New York Times' alleged debunking of oil pulling, we can see how it relies almost entirely on the ADA's opinion to support its argument, as though we can trust its position to be representative of the science, strictly as a matter of faith, which is the appeal to authority fallacy. That leaves the Times argument, self-described as deep reporting, reliant upon a single scientific source. So let's now turn our attention to that 2022 study, which is titled Effectiveness of Oil Pulling for Improving Oral Health, a Meta-Analysis. I've already shown you why you can't trust what the New York Times says about its own cited sources. So what does this meta-analysis really say? Well, to start out with, the authors defined their objective by stating, quote, "The effect of oil pulling on oral health has not yet been fully demonstrated." End quote. Notice that the use of the adjective fully here indicates that beneficial effects have been demonstrated, but require further study to gain a better understanding and be able to draw firmer conclusions. In other words, there is scientific evidence that oil pulling has oral health benefits, but it falls short of the absolute scientific proof demanded by the ADA and hence also by the New York Times. This also sufficiently illustrates how, when insisting that there is no reliable evidence of oil pulling's benefits, the ADA is using that adjective euphemistically to mean determinative. It's a rhetorical sleight of hand designed to lead people to falsely believe that there is no scientific evidence at all to support oil pulling. Further into the meta-analysis, the authors state, quote, "Coconut oil has 92% saturated medium-chain fatty acids, most of which are lauric acid, followed by other acids such as capric acid, caprylic acid, etc., and its glycolipid component is sucrose monolaurate. It can oxidize sucrose and Streptococcus mutans, preventing its regeneration and reattachment of plaque, and has anti-caries properties. Previous in vitro studies using a biofilm model have demonstrated the efficacy of coconut oil against Streptococcus mutans and Candida albicans." End quote. Note, therefore, how the very source cited by the Times in furtherance of its aim of convincing us that there is no scientific evidence that oil pulling has a beneficial effect on plaque reduction or risk of cavities, or dental caries, explicitly states that there is. Note that I've left the reference numbers intact in my quotation from the study. I'll come back to those references shortly. But first, since the study mentions intestinal candida, follow me briefly down another relevant tangent, further illustrating my point about the untrustworthiness of doctors and the media. Good patients do not research and think for themselves. I first learned about the yeast Candida albicans from the research I was necessarily doing at the time into gut health, and in 2014 I wrote an article debunking the claim from US News and World Report that intestinal candida overgrowth is not a real condition. I felt compelled to write that piece because it was so similar to how doctors were trying to gaslight me by insisting that leaky gut was not a real condition, which led me to being expelled by my primary care physician for insisting that it was. In that instance, having repeatedly insulted my intelligence, the doctor ended our conversation by saying I was not a good patient and storming out of the visiting room toward his office down the hall. Another reason he considered me a bad patient was that I had declined a flu shot, for which he additionally accused me of being a bad husband and father. I followed him down the hall on my way permanently to the exit, saying loudly enough that the clinic staff could overhear, "You are so ignorant. Go to PubMed and search the medical literature for leaky gut. Look up intestinal hyperpermeability. There are thousands of studies. It's completely uncontroversial. And at that point, this state-endorsed quack had escaped the grave threat of being educated by one of his patients, slamming his office door shut behind him. The PCP I established myself with after that, by contrast, actually listened to me. And he moreover humbly conceded that, yes, leaky gut is a real condition, but he couldn't really help me because, as he told me, quote, "You know a lot more about it than I do," end quote. Soon after that, though, he retired because of his frustrations about not being able to do his job, thanks to the government-enforced medical cartel dictating to him how he should treat his patients. He gave the example of an elderly woman whose medication the insurance industry was forcing him to change to a newer drug with less of a track record of safety, even though the medication he had her on had been working well for her. As he frustratedly put it, quote, "I am no longer able to practice medicine," end quote. Since that Candida article of mine is a decade old now, I just did a quick PubMed search for intestinal Candida overgrowth, turning up much more research that has since been done, with paper titles such as "The Dietary Modification and Treatment of Intestinal Candida Overgrowth, a Pilot Study," and "Could Candida overgrowth be involved in the pathophysiology of autism?" The gaslighting is incessant. It's also been a decade since I self-diagnosed and began successfully treating leaky gut, and the literature has only accumulated since. But still, you will see its significance downplayed, if not outright dismissed. The New York Times last year was still dismissing alternative approaches to gut health on the grounds that, while, quote, "a leaky intestinal lining can be associated with some medical conditions," end quote, leaky gut syndrome, quote, "is not recognized as a medical diagnosis," end quote. In other words, recognition of intestinal hyperpermeability as a real condition causing health problems in many people, including leaky gut being recognized as a prerequisite condition for at least 50 different autoimmune diseases, according to a 2005 paper in the BMJ journal Gut, has not translated into any diagnostic code being established for it or any treatment for it becoming standard of care. Why not? Simple. To successfully treat leaky gut requires natural approaches that don't involve the use of any patented medicine. And since they haven't developed any pharmaceutical drug for it that has gone through clinical trials, the medical cartel considers that there is nothing you can do about it that has been scientifically proven. Never mind common sense. As I learned the hard way, if you want help dealing with leaky gut, you are on your own. Again, you can read about my experiences and steps that I took to resolve my own symptoms in my free ebook about it. Where the Times says leaky gut is not a real medical diagnosis, it links to an article from the famed Cleveland Clinic in Ohio that describes leaky gut as a hypothetical condition, even while confirming that it is based on an increased intestinal permeability that does in fact occur in some gastrointestinal diseases. Never mind that leaky gut and intestinal hyperpermeability are literally synonymous in the literature. Like I said, the gaslighting from the medical establishment is incessant. It is not a hypothetical condition. It's a very real condition that scientists have been publishing studies about for decades. Cleveland Clinic adds that treatments that target the intestinal lining independently have not been shown to improve symptoms in people with intestinal hyperpermeability. I would challenge Cleveland Clinic and the rest of the medical establishment to explain then how I managed to so miraculously resolve my debilitating symptoms by targeting self-treatment on the integrity of my gut lining. Perhaps it wasn't really a miracle after all, and I really did have it right, while all these licensed quacks remain impervious to the evidence because the approach that I took involved precisely 0 pharmaceutical drugs. 0. Are you beginning to get a clear understanding of what I mean when I say that the New York Times and the rest of the legacy mainstream media, in service to the state, and hence also in service to the pharma-centric medical establishment, do policy advocacy instead of journalism, and that therefore you cannot trust a word they say when it comes to anything health-related? Are you beginning to see what I mean when I say that they persist in incessantly gaslighting you if an approach does not generate profits for the medical cartel? I learned a valuable lesson from that PCP who walked out on me for not getting a flu shot and for arguing with him that leaky gut is most certainly a real condition. Good patients are those who place their faith in the government, the mainstream media, and the state-licensed quacks who practice the standard of care as determined by the medical cartel to which they owe their lucrative careers. You're a bad patient, on the other hand, if you do your own research, think for yourself, trust your own judgment, and heal yourself precisely by ignoring pretty much everything they have to say. Yes, scientific evidence supports oil pulling. In the paragraph I quoted above from the 2022 meta-analysis, directly contradicting the purpose for which the New York Times cited it, the authors cited 3 prior studies on the benefits of oil pulling. For good measure, it's worth examining those primary sources as well. The first is a preliminary study from 2015 on the effect of coconut oil on plaque formation and gingivitis or gum disease, which observed a statistically significant decrease in both outcomes among study participants. The authors called for further research to authenticate the use of coconut oil as an effective oral antimicrobial agent, meaning that more vigorous studies should be done to more fully elucidate and demonstrate its health benefits. That study further states, quote, "Oil pulling has been proven to be an effective method in reducing plaque formation and plaque-induced gingivitis," end quote. While one could argue that this conclusion overstated the case for oil pulling, since scientific proof is such an elusive ideal, it is nevertheless instructive that this conclusion is literally the opposite of what the New York Times said we would find in the medical literature. The second study, cited in that paragraph from the 2022 meta-analysis, is a 2014 review detailing the biological mechanisms of the antimicrobial activity of coconut oil, which contains monolaurin and lauric acid, the latter of which, the review authors state matter-of-factly, quote, "decreases plaque formation," end quote. In their conclusion, the authors of that 2014 review state, quote, "Numerous beneficial effects have been claimed for coconut oil. This review on lauric acid provides mechanistic support for many of the beneficial effects of coconut oil," end quote. In other words, it makes perfect sense that coconut oil pulling would have oral health benefits, and we should expect these benefits to be demonstrable. Thus, once again, by simply examining the Times' own cited source, we have found the literal opposite of what the Times said we would find. Another observation worth noting from that 2014 review is that, while there are no profits to be gained by the medical establishment, if oil pulling were to become a widespread habit, synthetic versions of active compounds in coconut oil have been patented for use in antimicrobial products, with potential applications including pharmaceuticals, toothpaste, and mouthwash. Are you starting to get the picture? I started this article of mine with a lead paragraph saying that the practice of oil pulling dates back at least 3,000 years, which is supported with a hyperlink. The source to which I was linking is the third paper referenced in my above quote from the 2022 meta-analysis, which is a 2017 review titled "Oil Pulling and Importance of Traditional Medicine in Oral Health Maintenance." The authors of that review note that this ancient practice, quote, "is supported by recent studies for its efficacy and long-term use for maintaining and improving oral health," end quote. As they also wrote, quote, "Scientific evidence suggests that oil pulling therapy may reduce the total oral bacterial count and reduce plaque and gingival scores. Furthermore, it has been shown to diminish the susceptibility to dental caries from marked to slight or moderate level," end quote. The authors further observed that the potential health benefits of oil pulling therapy do not stop with oral health. In fact, they explained, quote, "The prevention and treatment of dental caries and periodontal disease have been shown to reduce the risk of diabetes and heart disease significantly," end quote. Oil pulling therapy, the review authors further concluded, quote, "is a simple and cost-effective method to improve and maintain good oral health, with no strict precautions required to follow the regimen. Compared to other forms of detox methods, it is effortless, simple, and harmless," end quote. Once again, we found precisely the opposite of what the Times says the science says. And we've done so simply by consulting the Times' own cited source from the scientific literature. But wait, there's more! The authors of the 2017 review additionally contrasted oil pulling's benefits and harmlessness with the downsides of using the types of prescription chlorhexidine mouthwashes that are recommended by the ADA Dental Trade Organization. Are you starting to see the problem with the New York Times citing the ADA and its wellness ambassador as credible sources for its deep reporting? As though whatever the ADA has to say is all we need to know about the science supporting oil pulling. Naturally, to obtain and keep the ADA seal of acceptance, product manufacturers have to pay the ADA a fee for the initial evaluation, plus an annual fee, plus a full renewal that is required every 5 years. Get it now? When alternative health practitioners recommend that people utilize oil pulling therapy, they are cutting the ADA and its members out of the financial picture, which the ADA naturally doesn't like. Hence the ADA being quoted by the cartel-loving New York Times to support its hoax claim to have debunked the practice of oil pulling. Now, take a moment to consider the fact that we've learned about this favorable evidence for oil pulling by simply examining the one study that was specifically selected by the Times to support its claim that this practice is unsupported by scientific evidence. To summarize, the New York Times treats us to the claim that there's no evidence that oil pulling has oral health benefits. It's just a waste of time and does not reduce plaque or improve gum health, the Times asserts. To support this debunking of oil pulling, the Times cites the ADA and the shared opinion of two dentists promulgating the ADA's position, which is like citing the Federal Reserve chairperson to support the claim that the free market is bad, and so we need this system of legalized counterfeiting. The sole scientific source cited by the Times to support its position is a 2022 meta-analysis whose authors explicitly state that the available evidence supports the use of oil pulling, including evidence that it does reduce plaque because of its proven antimicrobial properties, which is a parsimonious explanation for the observed reduction in cavity-causing bacteria and the risk of cavities among oil pulling practitioners. Because the expected outcome of a plaque reduction was not statistically demonstrated in the 2022 meta-analysis cited by the Times, its authors called for future clinical trials that, quote, should be more rigorous and better reported, end quote, than those included in their literature review, such as by having a longer duration of observation than most of the existing trials, which was a mere 2 weeks. So, do you see what the ADA and the New York Times mean when they say that the evidence in favor of oil pulling's oral health benefits have not yet reached the level of scientific proof, and that there are no reliable studies to support this practice? Do you see how they are trying to deceive you into thinking this means there's no scientific evidence at all to support this practice? Do you see how the conclusion that the Times wants you to accept is literally the opposite of what we find when we investigate the medical literature for ourselves, even when limiting ourselves just to examining the Times' own cited source? To revisit my own counter-anecdote to Times reporter Julia Calderon, 2 weeks is unlikely to be a sufficient duration to observe beneficial effects on plaque formation and gum disease. It took probably at least a year of routine oil pulling for my wife to be miraculously cured of what the dentists had told us was irreversible gum recession. In sum, we can see how, as usual, the New York Times is grossly mischaracterizing the science in service to the state and, by extension, in service to the pharmaceutical industry and decadent medical trade organizations whose financial interests the government has aligned itself with at the expense of public health. Somewhat humorously, in Moyer's article proclaiming no benefits of oil pulling, under a subheading on the risks of this habit, the Times concedes that oil pulling is unlikely to be dangerous. They managed to grasp at a few straws, though, by saying that oil pulling can clog your drain. You're supposed to spit it in the trash, not your sink. Or cause an upset stomach. You're supposed to spit it out, not swallow it. As for the conclusion that it is a waste of time, well, what is truly a waste of time is reading New York Times articles purporting to debunk natural approaches to health maintenance that don't happen to meet the approval of the government-enforced medical cartel. The reason for which is that widespread adoption of such natural remedies would threaten the financial interests of the pharmaceutical industry and irredeemably corrupt medical trade organizations like the AMA and ADA. If you are still not convinced, I encourage you to search oil pulling for yourself in PubMed and draw your own conclusion. Here are some sources I collected from my own research that you might want to consult. A 2008 study concluding that, quote, oil pulling can be used as an effective preventative adjunct in maintaining and improving oral health, end quote. A 2009 study concluding that, quote, oil pulling therapy showed a reduction in the plaque index modified gingival scores, and total colony count of aerobic microorganisms in the plaque of adolescents with plaque-induced gingivitis, end quote. The 2014 review detailing the biological mechanisms by which oil pulling has a beneficial effect on oral health. The preliminary 2015 study concluding that coconut oil pulling, quote, could be an effective adjuvant procedure in decreasing plaque formation and plaque-induced gingivitis, end quote. A 2016 study concluding that coconut oil pulling is as effective as chlorhexidine, the ADA recommended treatment, in the reduction of Streptococcus mutans, the most common cavity-causing bacteria. A 2017 randomized controlled trial concluding that, quote, oil pulling is effective in controlling plaque levels, end quote. The 2017 review article concluding that, quote, oil pulling, in addition to offering several oral health benefits, has also beneficial effects in overall health, end quote, and emphasizing that it may even, quote, reduce the risk of diabetes and heart disease, end quote. Conclusion. In closing, I must express my gratitude to the New York Times for having accidentally led me to discover a few additional sources providing scientific support for my own household's anecdotal experiences regarding the health benefits of coconut oil pulling. Perhaps reading New York Times articles purporting to debunk the health benefits of natural remedies isn't such a waste of time after all. Indeed, I consider it worth having spent so much of my own time considering the New York Times claim to elucidate the key lesson. If you want to be healthy, you must do your own research, think for yourself, and trust your own judgment, instead of placing blind faith in the government-enforced medical cartel and the professional propagandists who serve its financial interests by masquerading as journalists. Nobody paid me to do any of this research or to write this article. My work would not be possible without support from readers like you. If you appreciate the insights I have provided you with here, please consider making a financial contribution to support my truly independent journalism exposing harmful mainstream propaganda.